3 days before my wedding, half of our guests canceled. Not because of weather, not because of travel, because they believed a rumor. Someone had been telling everyone the same story, that I ran away, that I got scared, that the wedding was canceled. And the strangest part was, the person spreading that story was my own mother. By the morning of the ceremony, she was confident the hall would be empty. She even told relatives there was no point showing up. But what she didn't know was that the ceremony had already been moved. And when she walked into the venue expecting silence, she heard something she never expected. Music, applause, and the officiant saying my name. Before I explain why my mother told everyone I ran away from my own wedding, my name is Samantha Hale. I'm 29 years old, and this happened last spring in Charlotte, North Carolina. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories where the truth slowly unfolds and everything changes at the last moment, consider subscribing. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I read every single comment. Now let me explain why my own mother tried to convince everyone that I abandoned my wedding. Because the story actually started a week earlier. The first sign that something was wrong came 5 days before the wedding. My fiancé Ethan and I were finishing seating arrangements when my phone rang. It was my cousin Jessica. She sounded hesitant. "Samantha, is everything okay?" "Of course," I said. "Why?" There was a pause on the phone. "Because Aunt Linda told everyone the wedding might not happen." Aunt Linda, my mother. At first I assumed it was a misunderstanding. Weddings are chaotic. Schedules change. Messages get crossed. So I called my mother immediately. "Mom," I asked, "why are people saying the wedding might be canceled?" She laughed lightly. "Oh, sweetheart, people exaggerate things." But something about her tone felt strange, too casual. The next day, another guest called. Then another. Then 2 more. Each conversation sounded almost identical. "Your mom said you were overwhelmed. She told us you might be reconsidering. She said you needed space." By the end of the afternoon, I had heard the same story 4 times, and it was always coming from the same source, my mother. That evening, Ethan sat across from me at the kitchen table. "You look stressed," he said. I showed him the messages. He read them slowly, then leaned back in his chair. "Why would your mom tell people that?" That was the question I couldn't answer. Because growing up, my mother loved being involved in everything, especially events where she could control the narrative. Looking back, this wasn't the first time something like this happened. When I graduated college, my mother told relatives I almost failed. When I got my first promotion, she said it was temporary. Every major moment in my life somehow turned into a story about how fragile things were, or how close I was to failing. And now, apparently, I was running away from my own wedding. By Wednesday, the cancellations began. Some guests said they were confused. Others said they didn't want to travel if the wedding wasn't happening. A few politely said they would wait and see. Every time someone canceled, the same explanation appeared again. "Your mother told us you weren't ready." Finally, I drove to my parents' house. My mother answered the door smiling, like nothing unusual was happening. "Mom," I said immediately, "why are you telling people I ran away from my wedding?" Her smile faded slightly. "I never said that." "Yes, you did," I replied. "Half the guest list heard it from you." She sighed dramatically. "I'm just trying to protect you." "Protect me from what?" I asked. "Embarrassment," she said. "Weddings fall apart all the time." Her words hung in the air, because suddenly it sounded less like concern and more like preparation. Driving home that night, Ethan said something that made everything clearer. "What if she's trying to control the story before the wedding even happens?" I frowned. "Why would she do that?" Ethan shrugged. "Some people like being the center of the drama." And unfortunately, my mother had always been that kind of person. The next morning, we made a decision not to cancel the wedding, not to confront my mother again, but to change one small detail, something simple, something she would never expect. We moved the ceremony, and we didn't tell her, because if she wanted to show up expecting an empty hall, we were going to let her. Ethan and I spent that evening making phone calls, not to everyone, just the people we trusted the most. My maid of honor, his best man, a few close relatives. We explained the situation calmly. My mother had been spreading rumors that the wedding might collapse, so we decided to move the ceremony to a smaller chapel attached to the venue. Same building, different room, and we asked everyone to keep it quiet, because sometimes the best way to deal with chaos is to simply step around it. The next 2 days were strange. More guests canceled. More confused messages arrived. Some people asked if I was okay. Others sounded almost disappointed. Apparently, my mother had been telling people dramatic stories, that I was overwhelmed, that Ethan and I were arguing, that I might not even show up. It was impressive in a strange way. She had created an entire narrative without ever asking me a single question. On Thursday afternoon, my Aunt Carol called me. Her voice was cautious. "Samantha, your mother seems very worried." "Worried about what?" I asked. "She told everyone you were reconsidering the marriage." I almost laughed, because at that exact moment Ethan was sitting beside me reviewing honeymoon plans. We weren't reconsidering anything, except perhaps our guest list. That evening, Ethan leaned back in his chair and said something interesting. "What if she wants the wedding to fail?" I frowned. "Why would she want that?" He shrugged. "Because if the wedding goes perfectly, she's not the center of attention." At first I dismissed the idea, but the more I thought about it, the more familiar the pattern felt. My mother had always loved dramatic moments, family arguments, unexpected announcements, public emotional scenes. She wasn't necessarily cruel, but she thrived in situations where everyone turned to her for explanations, and a wedding that quietly celebrated someone else didn't give her much room for that. By Friday, our guest list looked very different. Almost 30 people had canceled. Others were unsure. But the people who truly mattered were still coming. Friends, close relatives, the people who actually knew me. And strangely enough, the smaller list made the wedding feel more personal. Late Friday night, my cousin Jessica sent me a message. "You're not going to believe what your mom just said." "What?" I asked. "She told everyone the ceremony probably won't happen." I stared at the screen. Apparently, my mother was now completely certain that the wedding would collapse, which meant something important. She was expecting an empty room. Saturday morning, we made one more adjustment. The ceremony time moved forward by 30 minutes. The chapel doors would close once the processional began, and only the confirmed guests would know about the change. My mother still believed the ceremony was scheduled in the large ballroom, the one she expected to be empty. If you're still here with this story, thank you. Situations like this are strange, because sometimes the biggest tension in a wedding isn't between the couple. It's between expectations and reality. And if you've ever had someone create drama around an important moment in your life, you probably understand how complicated it can feel. Now let me tell you what happened on the morning of the wedding, because that's when everything finally came together. The morning of the ceremony was surprisingly calm. Hair, makeup, bridesmaids laughing quietly. For the first time all week, the rumors stopped mattering. Because everyone in that room knew the truth. The wedding was happening. Exactly as planned. Just not the way my mother expected. At exactly 2 o'clock, the music began. Guests filled the chapel. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows. The officiant stepped forward. Ethan was already waiting at the altar. And just as the doors closed, someone rushed into the main ballroom next door, looking for the ceremony that wasn't there. My mother. The music inside the chapel began softly, the kind of quiet piano melody that fills a room without anyone needing to say a word. I stood behind the doors with my father-in-law, who had offered to walk me down the aisle when my own father stopped speaking to me years ago. The chapel was warm with sunlight coming through the tall stained glass windows. Guests were seated. Ethan stood at the front waiting. And for the first time that entire week, the rumors didn't matter anymore, because the wedding was already happening. At the exact same moment, my mother was walking into the large ballroom next door. The room was completely empty. No music, no decorations, no guests. Just rows of unused chairs. My cousin later told me she watched my mother walk into that room expecting to see chaos. Instead, she found silence and confusion, because the ceremony wasn't there. My mother apparently stood in that empty ballroom for several seconds, looking around, checking her phone, then asking one of the venue staff where everyone was. The coordinator smiled politely. "The ceremony started in the chapel," she said, "about 10 minutes ago." That was the moment my mother realized something had gone very wrong. She rushed out of the ballroom, her heels echoing through the hallway, the same hallway that connected the ballroom to the chapel entrance. But wedding ceremonies don't pause. The music continues. The vows begin. And by the time she reached the chapel doors, the ceremony was already halfway through. The chapel doors were closed, not locked, just closed. My mother pushed them open quietly, trying not to interrupt. But the sound of the door creaking made several guests turn their heads, including my aunt, and my cousin, and eventually, me. I was standing at the altar holding Ethan's hands. The officiant was speaking about commitment and partnership. When the doors opened behind the guests, I saw my mother step inside. Her expression wasn't angry. It was shocked, because the room was full. Every seat occupied, every guest focused on the ceremony. The wedding she told everyone wouldn't happen was happening perfectly. The guests who remained were the people who mattered. Friends, close family members, people who didn't believe the rumors. When my mother entered, several of them glanced at her briefly, then turned back toward the altar, because the ceremony had already started, and no one was stopping it now. The officiant continued speaking calmly. Then he looked at Ethan. "Please repeat after me." Ethan smiled slightly, his voice steady. "I promise to stand beside you." My mother stood near the back of the chapel, listening, realizing she had completely lost control of the narrative she created. Then the officiant turned toward me. "Samantha, please repeat after me." I took a slow breath, holding Ethan's hands gently, and began my vows. Not rushed, not shaken, just calm. Because the moment had finally arrived. The wedding everyone thought wouldn't happen was already underway. When the vows ended, the chapel became completely quiet. The officiant looked at both of us, then smiled. "And now, by the authority given to me, I pronounce you husband and wife." The room filled with applause, and somewhere near the back of the chapel, my mother stood completely still, because the story she told everyone had just ended. When the officiant finished speaking, the room filled with applause. People stood. Some guests wiped away tears. Ethan kissed me gently, and the entire chapel erupted with cheers. For a moment, I forgot everything that had happened during the week. The rumors, the cancellations, the tension. Because standing there at the altar, the only thing that mattered was that the wedding had happened exactly the way we wanted. We walked down the aisle together while guests clapped. Friends hugged us. Someone threw flower petals. Laughter filled the room again. But as we reached the back of the chapel, I noticed my mother standing near the doorway. She hadn't moved. Her face looked pale, like someone who had just realized their plan didn't work. For a second, our eyes met. Neither of us spoke. She opened her mouth slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but the moment passed. Because guests were already guiding Ethan and me toward the reception hall. The celebration was continuing, and no one wanted to pause the day for an argument. The reception took place in a smaller hall beside the chapel. Soft music played. Tables were decorated with simple white flowers. Guests began talking again, laughing, sharing stories. And slowly the mood shifted from ceremony to celebration. But something else was happening too. People were whispering. Several relatives approached quietly. "Your mom told us the wedding might not happen. We almost didn't come." "Why would she say that?" I simply smiled politely. "I'm glad you came anyway," I said. Because explaining the full situation right then would have ruined the atmosphere. About 15 minutes later, my mother entered the reception hall. She looked uncomfortable, not angry, not dramatic, just unsure. A few relatives looked at her with confusion. Others avoided eye contact, because by now everyone understood something important. The rumors didn't match reality. Eventually, my mother walked toward our table. "Samantha," she said softly, "I think we should talk." Her voice sounded careful, almost cautious. But I shook my head gently. "Not today," I said. "Because weddings are meant to celebrate beginnings, not reopen old arguments." She stood there quietly for a moment, looking around the room, seeing guests smiling, hearing laughter, watching the celebration she had predicted would never happen. And slowly it became clear she understood something. She had lost control of the story. Ethan squeezed my hand gently under the table. "You okay?" he whispered. I nodded. Better than okay. Because sometimes the best response to someone creating chaos is simply refusing to participate in it. Later that evening, Ethan's best man stood up for the first toast. He raised his glass and smiled. "To Samantha and Ethan," he said, "to a couple who proved that love doesn't depend on rumors." The room filled with laughter and applause, and across the room, my mother sat quietly, listening, realizing the story she told everyone had completely unraveled. By the time dinner was served, the tension in the room had softened. Guests were laughing again. Music played softly near the dance floor. Ethan and I had finally sat down for the first time that day. But every now and then, I noticed my mother watching from across the room. Not angry, not dramatic, just thoughtful. Like someone replaying the entire week in their mind and realizing it didn't end the way they expected. Later that evening, she approached again. This time, her voice was calmer. "Samantha, can we talk for a minute?" I looked at Ethan. He nodded gently. So I stepped outside the reception hall with her. The night air was cool and quiet. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she finally said something surprising. "I didn't think the wedding would actually happen." I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" She sighed. "I thought you were rushing into things." Apparently, my mother had convinced herself that the wedding was a mistake. Instead of talking to me directly, she decided to control the narrative around it. If people believed the wedding might collapse, then she could say later that she saw the warning signs. It suddenly made sense. Every big moment in my life had followed the same pattern. Graduation, my first job, now my wedding. My mother would quietly spread doubt. Just enough uncertainty so that if something went wrong, she could say she predicted it. But this time, nothing went wrong. "So you told people I ran away?" I asked. She looked embarrassed. "I didn't say it exactly like that." But the answer was close enough. Rumors don't need exact words. They grow on their own once someone plants the idea. Then she admitted something else. "I was afraid," she said quietly. "Afraid of what?" I asked. "That once you were married, you wouldn't need me anymore." For the first time that evening, her voice sounded honest, not defensive, just uncertain. I thought about that for a moment. Parents sometimes struggle with change, especially when their children build independent lives, but fear doesn't excuse creating chaos. I never needed rumors to stay connected to you, I said calmly. You could have just talked to me. She nodded slowly. I see that now. Neither of us apologized directly, but sometimes understanding is enough to end a conflict. Because the wedding had already happened. The celebration was still going, and nothing she said that night could change that. When we walked back into the reception hall, the band had started playing again. Guests were dancing, friends were laughing. Ethan waved from across the room, and the atmosphere felt exactly the way a wedding should feel. Warm, joyful, peaceful. Looking back now, the strangest part of that week wasn't the rumors. It was how small they became once the ceremony actually began. Because in the end, people remember what truly happens, not the stories someone tries to tell beforehand. And when my mother walked into that chapel expecting silence, the music had already started. Thank you for staying with this story. If you enjoy calm, emotional stories where the truth slowly unfolds, consider subscribing. And tell me in the comments, what would you do if someone close to you started rumors about an important moment in your life? I read every single comment. There's another story waiting on your screen, and when you're ready, I'll see you there.